This is the Aftermarket Radio Network.
Welcome, everyone, to yet another episode of Diagnosing the Aftermarket A to Z. I'm Matt Fanslow, and only a Sith deals in absolutes. That and more after a word from our sponsors, NAPA Autotech Training and Pico Technology. For 98 years, the NAPA name has meant quality parts and service. It also reflects top quality training programs to help you build a more successful vehicle repair business. No doubt, the technician shortage is impacting everyone, but you're not facing this battle alone. NAPA has the solution by making NAPA Autotech training available near you. NAPA Autotech provides automotive aftermarket technicians career development opportunities through structured, disciplined, measured, and high-quality technical instruction, no matter the technician or service advisor's skill level. This instruction enhances understanding of vehicle systems, increases first-time repair capability, and overall customer satisfaction. This instruction enhances understanding of vehicle systems, increases first-time repair capability, and overall customer satisfaction. It also prepares technicians to become ASE certified. It's a fact technicians who receive training to improve their knowledge and skills have a higher sense of job satisfaction. This reduces technician turnover and increases productivity, directly improving a shop's profitability. It is vital to the success of a shop's business that today's technicians are equipped to diagnose and repair today's complex vehicles. With our ever-changing technology, the technician's knowledge and skills need to be updated and refreshed on a regular basis. As you labor over the decision of whether to send your techs to get their skills sharpened, keep in mind, NAPA Autotech training is an investment, not an expense, and it's available to all. Much of NAPA Autotech's training is offered in more than one format to accommodate varieties of learning styles and training preferences so each person can maximize their learning. Whether you're more of a hands-on person or enjoy learning at your own pace, NAPA Autotech is here to provide you with the training you need in the format that works best for you. To learn more about what NAPA Autotech offers, contact napaautotech.com. I see a lot of confusion online, and I guess in classes and in the shop and in conversation with techs. There's a big misconception or really just confusion. Confusion between, before I jump to just the difference or between, we're talking about pressure. Maybe I should have quoted David Bowie and Queen, but it's too late for that. When we're talking about pressure in America specifically, we typically deal in two different scales, and that's not necessarily where the confusion lies. It gets into definitions and I guess scales to a degree. The reality is in America, we typically talk about PSI and inches of mercury. We use PSI for anything above atmospheric pressure, and we use inches of mercury typically for anything below atmospheric. And therein lies the beginning of the confusion. We have to remember, and I think if we ask somebody outright, especially if they fix cars for a living, what kind of pressure is all around you? What is the atmospheric pressure? They would answer, and maybe fairly accurate to the more extremes, at least altitudes. So at sea level, they'll probably tell you it's close to 14.7 to 1. That has to get cut back to what I'm going to say about the pressure. I can't say 14.7 to 1. That's a ratio. It makes sense if I would explain it, but it's not what I'm not. At sea level, they would say 14.7 psi, roughly. That's not typically how we talk about it or how we see it on a scan tool. And definitely not how we see it on our vacuum gauges. And for those of you who haven't been in this industry all that long, for maybe the last 10 years or more. A vacuum gauge is a gauge that looks a lot like a fuel pressure gauge or a compression gauge that used to screw in or plug in with a hose, if you will, into the intake manifolds. There'd be ports everywhere, and we could watch manifold pressure, and we would read that in inches of mercury at just atmospheric, not hooked up to anything. It would read 0. Well, that's 0 gauge pressure. It's not, I don't want to say it's not accurate, but you could make an argument it's not all that accurate. But it's reading 0 with nothing, just with atmospheric pressure. And then you hook it up to manifold vacuum and engines running. It's pulling it into a vacuum. Well, vacuum is just any pressure below atmospheric. So we kind of get in these weird scales, right? 0 and above, PSI, 0 and below, inches of mercury. But the reality is those scales go both ways. They go below 0. We would be negative PSI and we could be positive inches of mercury. And if you look at boosted engines or something, aspirated, you could often see inches of mercury go above 0 and read what we would consider what would normally be in a vacuum, maybe a positive inches of mercury. And for some, that was very confusing. Then we get into absolutes. Mainly that was introduced with manifold absolute pressure sensors. And that involves the sensor itself being built with, I guess we'll call it just a chamber of, well, they like to tell us 0 pressure, absolute. I'm sorry. This probably has such little place in an automotive podcast, but technically that's not true. Technically, you can't have absolute 0 pressure. Or if you do, over time, you could birth a universe. And I know that's out there. Just in the world of quantum mechanics or quantum field theory, it's a dangerous subject. It's a can of worms. I'm sorry, but it's kind of cool too. If you were to let's talk about Schrodinger just for a second. And most of us have heard about the Schrodinger's cat, right? The cat in the box, and there's some sort of a device in there that could kill the cat, and it had a certain chance of being set off and killing the cat, or it might not set off and the cat would be alive. And the cat, before you open the box, is in a state of a superposition where it is both alive and dead at the same time until you open the box to observe what happened. The reality is that concept was brought up as a kind of a skewer. I don't want to call it a joke, but it was really to kind of like call out some of the absurdities in quantum mechanics or quantum field theory, but really quantum mechanics. And that's not to just sound like pompous and stuff. This is the cool stuff. One thing though, in that world, was somebody came up with a principle, Heisenberg. And no, not the same guy from Breaking Bad, the real Heisenberg, which he based the name off of. But he had a principle of the more you knew about the position of a particle, the less you knew about its speed. And the more you knew about its speed, the less you knew about its position. So now let's think about that. If we go into absolute 0 pressure, just following thermodynamics with the ideal gas law, that would imply or suggest or dictate or demand absolute 0 temperature, which would mean no particle movement, which would mean now we know that they're not moving, so we know their speed. Because we now know their speed, we don't know where they are. So I misspoke there for a second, sorry. At absolute temperature, no movement, we now know their speed, we don't know where they are, which means they could be everywhere at once, right? See how this falls apart? I know. What the heck's that got to do with fixing cars? But it's kind of cool, right? And it also turns out that at near perfect vacuums, bubbles of energy form. Those bubbles are powerful enough or have so much energy in them, they create universes. So there is a very strong argument that the universe we're in right now was created from a bubble of energy from a near absolute 0 pressure area. All right. That should make your week. Back to our world. The reference is to very, very high vacuum, low pressure. And then you start getting these readings that are almost in the way opposite of what we're used to. And again, that's where we start getting a lot of confusion is if I'm looking at my scan tool and I'm seeing that the engine is idling at 10 inches of vacuum, what is that really telling me? Because a lot of us, if we knew the engine vacuum on a lot of cars, we were expecting closer to 20 inches of vacuum or 18, depending on the car. Well, this is reading 10. So is that bad? But if it's 10 inches of mercury absolute, well, now we're starting from 30 because 30 inches of vacuum, or I shouldn't say that, but 30 inches would be the absolute pressure of the atmosphere, right? That would be zero. That would be close to 15 psi. So I don't know. Sounds like I'm jumping around a little bit. Maybe I really am. But the reality is that the ratio between inches of mercury to psi is 2-1. So 2 inches of mercury is equal to 1 psi. Hence, if you have 30 inches of mercury pressure, you have about 15 psi, which was, guess what, close to sea level, 14.7-1. We can start to see where this starts to get rough, right? And part of it, I think, is my explanations have been up and down and went into physics world. But the reality is that in America, I think specifically, we talk about pressure above and below zero, zero being atmospheric. So we talk about pressure above and below atmospheric, and we have different terms, PSI, and then vacuum, PSI pressure, pounds per square inch, and then vacuum. And maybe not intuitively, we know by definition what that is, but now seeing it on the car or seeing it as numbers on a scan tool or on a gauge, it kind of gets forgotten about. And the reality is when we're talking about vacuum, we might be better off thinking about everything as a pressure scale from zero being near, or, at least for the sake of discussion, 0 psi. I don't want to say absolute pressure. It almost goes against my grain, but for the sake of discussion, we could say 0 pressure. And then using that scale, 15 would be what's around us right now, specifically around sea level. And then, if you're living in, high altitude areas, that's going to be different. And then anything above that would be, however much. If it's got 10 psi a boost, that's 10 psi over 15. So now it's got 25 psi in the intake, but that's absolute. And I just find that watching conversations take place, there is a big misnomer or misunderstanding, or just maybe also just not thinking about it, forgetting that you do have to understand when somebody's talking about pressure are they talking about gauge pressure or are they talking about absolute pressure? And then making the adjustments. One thing and it's very American with the scales of inches of mercury and PSI, if we do shift over to the metric system, many times that's eliminated, right? We don't really read stuff in the scan tool plus or minus or positive or negative kilopascals, right? It's usually just the number. And in a way, that is a good way to think about it. I would urge people to learn the kilopascals, just to make your life easier looking at the scan tool, but also just the way of thinking about pressure. 0 kilopascals is not atmospheric. It's more like 100, right? 100 kilopascals is pretty close to atmospheric. 0 being ultra low, and then we see cars idling in the mid 30s, somewhere in there, right? Depending on the car and where we're at, all that jazz. And then boosted, it goes above that. It's rough to go from American scales to metric. I get it. And it's not this big campaign to get us all to switch to the metric system. Is, logical or illogical as that may be, different debate for a different episode, or, just a different debate. But the idea behind it, I think, is important. Thinking about pressure in that manner, that is important to start trying to think of things in all one scale even. and then being able to make the shift, or being able to speak specifically in absolute pressure or gauge pressure, and being able to, I guess, just speak in those terms or identify that right away. And sometimes we see designations like that with PSIG, pounds per square inch gauge, and PSIA sometimes. And then on our scan tools, usually it will not tell us if it's absolute. Even if it says map, sometimes it reports to us in gauge. It's frustrating. So what might be a really good way for us to differentiate between the two, right? If we needed to know on our scan tool, how is that reporting to us? What might be a quick way to do that, right? Key on, engine off, right? The engine is not running. How is it reporting atmospheric pressure to us? And that is a good quick way to determine, is this PID giving us information in gauge or absolute? And now I can look at that PID and make decisions if I need to. I guess to just recap, I can't speak for other countries. And I can't say that in conversations I see on professional forums, networks, and social media groups, pages, that I necessarily go look to see who lives where when I see misconceptions. I do know it's heavy towards the United States. And it's not some big bash. It's just, it's how we split up our scales. It's how we've decided to report things and discuss things and, again, display it, if you will. So gauge pressure, the key with gauge pressure, I think, to remember is atmospheric pressure is shown as 0. That's the big giveaway. Absolute pressure references a cell of some sort of very, very low pressure, very, very near perfect vacuum. And that compares that to the pressure it's reading. So therefore, atmospheric at sea level-ish will be displayed around 15 psi, 14.7, 14.6. It's important to be able to think in those terms and to remember that, and remember the scales. Remember that 2 inches of mercury equals 1 psi, so that you can make that shift in your brain. Just, it's a simple ratio, but something to keep in mind. And then, especially when working with absolute pressure that's reported to us in inches of mercury, that we can make this switch in our minds to see what, in psi might be more intuitive. And then also remember kilopascals. Generally, when we see something on our scan tools given to us in kilopascals, that is showing us an absolute, right? Key on, engine off, we're going to see pressure, kilopascals, scale 100, 101, something like that, near sea level. And then in vacuum, it's going to go below that, so engine idling in the mid 30s, something like that. I think that's just important to keep in mind. And hopefully that helps when starting to discuss pressures, and stop thinking about vacuum as being negative. I think that's also, even if it's displayed to you in negative, try to think of vacuum as still pressure, low pressure, below atmospheric pressure. It doesn't matter how much, as long as it's below atmospheric pressure, it's considered vacuum. But try not to think of it as vacuum. Just try to think of it as low pressure. I think that'll help. And I hope that even with my jumping around a little bit, that listening to this, maybe listening to it a couple of times, and the recap is enough to help you better understand what those scan tool PIDs are telling you. I'm not talking about strict, if you see this pressure, then it means the car needs this or that, but really to be able to use that as a tool to understand what the manifold pressure is typically. Of course, this translates over into fuel tank pressure and so many things. That's the big stuff, right? Engine vacuum, manifold vacuum. And with that, I think I will leave you. If you have any questions or criticisms about this episode, please don't hesitate to reach out. You can email me at mattfanslowpodcast@gmail.com. If you have topic ideas or questions for me to answer, please, again, fire away. You can also find me on social media, send me a message through Messenger. I'd just really like to thank NAPA Autotech Training and Pico Technology for sponsoring. Thanks to the Aftermarket Radio Network for just making this all possible. And yeah, next time you're thinking about absolute zero pressure, just remember universes came from that. Or you could just bring it up on a date or in a group and maybe impress some people. I don't know. Probably not. I've tried it. It doesn't work. So anyways, thanks again for listening. I do really appreciate it. And if you're listening to this or watching it on YouTube, it really does help if you hit the like button. It helps the channel. It helps all the channels. So really any YouTube channel that you enjoy, stuff like that, hit the like button. And yeah, if you like it enough, please subscribe. And until next time, take care.